Jeremy, I want you to. Good afternoon, Joshua Walker here at Japan Society. Thank you for joining us for a very special webinar that really hits the mark in what we're going through right now. The title couldn't be more applicable. The Storm Makes You Stronger, Managing Your Mind in the Face of Crisis, with my good friend Jeremy Hunter, who I can't wait to introduce you to and turn this over. But before I do that, I just want to simply thank our sponsors for business and policy, our global leaders, Citi and Deloitte, our corporate partners, Mizuho Financial Group, Toyota Motor North America, and United Airlines. I know we have a lot of those company representatives joining us. So hello and welcome. And also we have many board members and many of Japan Society staff themselves that are joining today. So how do you face great challenges and come out better on the other side? How do you explore the skills and think about what you need to manage challenges? Well, I can't think of anybody better than my friend Jeremy Hunter. He's a global authority on mindfulness and leadership. He's the great grandson of a sumo wrestler, so you can't get any cooler than that. He's currently the founding director of the Executive Leadership Institute. He's an associate professor of practice at the Peter Drucker Graduate School of Management at Claremont Graduate University in California. He's a co-founder and partner of Transform LLC in Tokyo, Japan, and he's been helping leaders transform themselves in the face of change and challenge for 2 decades, including myself, which I'm particularly excited about. He's concerned about the quality of the human experience and how to live a meaningful, engaged, and effective life. He works with healthy companies that aspire to greatness. He's designed and led leadership development programs for Fortune 200 aerospace, Fortune 50 banking and finance, and arts and civic nonprofits. The list goes on. He's been featured in pretty much every medium you can imagine, from Wall Street Journal to The Economist to the Financial Times to the National Public Radio, Los Angeles Times. I could keep on going, Jeremy, but I don't want to keep on embarrassing you because I know you hate this stuff. But the last thing I have to say is, here's a guy who has a Ph.D. from the University of Chicago, and he also holds degrees from Harvard University in Wittenberg. Without further ado, Jeremy, thank you so much for this very timely webinar.
Thank you, Josh. It's a real pleasure. Well, thank you to the staff. Thank you to everybody there. Thanks to you, and thanks to everybody who's tuned in today. There's a little sound echo maybe somewhere, just to check in on what's happening there. There we go. All right. Sorry, I'm still getting a little sound feedback just before we begin. Okay, so in the the title "Storm Makes You Stronger," I'd like to just start with a little poll, and in the chat box on YouTube, you should see a link, and if you could click on that link, and then you'll go through a little process and answer the question that shows up. And then what I thought we could do is just take the temperature of how's everybody doing, right? And I'm going to share that screen now, and we're going to build this together. All right, let's just take a look at this is happening. So this is building live as you're typing into it. There we go. Look at that. Oh, hopeful is edging out anxious. That's great. Oh, anxious is pulling ahead, right? So the bigger the word, the more people who are typing that same word in. Okay, worried, concerned, overwhelming. Well, hopeful is ahead of hopeless, so that's good. Unsure. Okay, let's see how it goes. We'll leave it there just for a few more minutes. So I'll put the link in the chat one more time in case you missed it. There we go. So you could just click on that link. There we are. Drained, right? Been a lot. Contented. There's some more. All right, I'll leave it there for another 10 seconds or so we can work with it. I like that anxious and hopeful are having their own battle. Right, beautiful. Right. Stressed, confused, right? Distracted. Overwhelming. All right, thank you very much. I'll come back to the presentation. Here's a SoundCloud or a word cloud I did a few weeks ago. So it's interesting, uncertainty didn't show up in ours today, but you can get the range. What I love about this is you can see the range of what people are experiencing. And you know, that's real for folks. So where does the title come from? The title comes from this Haruki Murakami novel, Kafka on the Shore. One thing is certain: when you come out of the storm, you won't be the same person who walked in, and that's what this storm is all about. And you know, obviously, we're in a storm, and who are you going to be when the storm is all done? Is the question I've been asking folks and myself for the last few months. And ideally, you know, that the storm makes you stronger in that, you know, we know how to face challenges in a way that's transformative rather than disabling. And for me, that's largely, and it's certainly a matter of luck in one's life circumstance, and it's also a matter of skill. And that's what I'd like to talk about today. Like, what are the skills that we need to do to face challenges that seem overwhelming at times, right? So let me say a little bit about how I got here. My own storm started in 1992, actually, and I was at that time a little over 20, and was diagnosed with a terminal illness and was told that basically I had a 90% chance of dying within 5 years. And it was an autoimmune disease affecting my immune system, and there was no cure. There still is no cure. The treatment was actually worse than the disease. And so at the same time, when I heard the verdict of 90%, there's a part of me inside that thought, oh, that's good news. And somebody's got to be in the 10%. And I decided that was going to be me. And at that time, I was an East Asian Studies major at Wittenberg University. And I went back to school and talked to my Japanese religions professor and said, this is what's happening to me. And he was a very authoritative and truly wonderful human being, and we're still friends now, almost 30 years later. And he reaches into his desk and he pulls out a book called The Three Pillars of Zen by Philip Kapleau. And it was the first book in English to teach Westerners how to do Zen practice. And he said, "Here, read this." And so I read that book, and it taught me how to work with my mind in some way. And a year passed, another year passed, 4 years passed. I ended up going to graduate school, and I ended up living another 17 years after that. And I'm absolutely convinced it was partly that due to that book that taught me, what to do with all the stuff going on in my head. You're 20 years old and you're trying to make your way in the world, and suddenly you're faced with your own mortality. And so, that really set the stage for my own career and what I do, which is to help people, deal with their own minds at some level. And so that was my storm. And what I learned from that was that, basically when you're facing these kind of situations, you have three options, right? One is to collapse, right? Which is not really an option. So let's take that off the table. Then there's coping. And that's kind of a temporary option, but at best it gets you back to baseline. And I think that the opportunity that these kind of experiences have for us is that we can use them to transform ourselves, and that at the end of it we're better, we're stronger, we're more caring, right? And so then how to do that, right? And at the same time, if you are in any kind of leadership position, or even if you don't have manager in your title, you're leading something in your life, that internal platform of understanding how to manage all the things that are going on inside you is really an essential platform of strength from which to lead. And so what we'll do today is we'll check in. Well, we've done that in a bit already. And then what I want to talk about are what are the three principles for managing your own experience, and then how do you manage fear? And what zone are you in? This will make sense in about 15 minutes. And then what are your resources and how do you draw on those resources? And then we'll have a little time for Q&A. So as Joshua mentioned, I teach at the Drucker School of Management. And as you know, Peter Drucker was a great friend of Japan, and for many years, advised Japan on economic policy and industrial policy and all of that. And he had this great insight, and that he's also considered to be the founding father of the discipline of management, right? And was really, truly an amazing human being. That he had this insight that you can't manage other people unless you manage yourself first, right? It seems like a foregone conclusion, but when I started doing this in 2003, I had people say, we teach management, we don't teach self-management. We teach finance, but we don't teach you how to balance a checkbook. Why would we need to do that? And so, but events happen, and you start to see 2008 happened actually, and then I never had to make that argument again. And now we're back almost 10 years later, and we have to learn how to manage ourselves, right? And at the same time, he also had the statement that leadership is defined by results. So if you've got the notion that you can't manage other people unless you manage yourself first, and that leadership is defined by results, you put those two ideas together and you get something like this. That I think that we have two games to play, basically. One is the inner game, which is all the stuff that's happening inside you. And then there's the outer game, which is the world, all the things in the world you need to be effective with, which is like your job, parenting, being a spouse to somebody, being a friend or family member to somebody, and doing that in an effective and kind way. And that you need to be able to do this now, right? And you have to manage both the outer game and the inner game, and to be able to ideally bring that to bear in real time. So let me give you an example of that. I have a client who's in financial services, and she's in a meeting with, she's a partner in her firm, and she's in a meeting with a very important client of hers. And somebody in this meeting says something kind of inflammatory, and this wave of anger goes through the room. And my client notices that the wave is inside herself as well. And so she did what we kind of practice to do. It's like when an emotion happens, she puts her hands or puts her palms on the tabletop and directs her attention to the sensation of the tabletop, which distracts her from the emotion that's kind of roaring inside. That buys her time to let that emotion die down for a moment. And then she turns her attention out into the room and acknowledges what everybody's feeling. And then she redirects their attention in a positive direction. At the beginning of this, she looked over at her client and he was collecting his papers to get ready to leave. And at the end of it, his papers were down back on the table. And had he left, her career would have gone with him out that door. And so that to me is like the archetypal example of somebody who's managing the outer game and the inner game and doing it right now in the moment. And so that's what, in a way, we're kind of aiming for. Why do we need to do this? Is that mindlessness is the basic condition of human beings, right? Of the many things that we don't learn in school, this is one of them. And it's a fairly well-established fact. 90+% of the time, you're operating on automatic pilot, and we don't really know what we're experiencing at any given point. I read a statistic recently that said only a third of people can tell you what emotion they're experiencing in a given moment. So if you don't know what emotion you're experiencing, what thoughts are in your head, how is your body doing, right? And how is that influencing the choices you have, the action you take, and the result you get? It's kind of like flying blind, right? You're like flying without being able to read the gauges. And so, we talk a lot about mindfulness, but I find that a lot of people don't really know what that means, but everybody kind of knows what mindlessness is. And so part of what this process is tuning into what's going on, right? Like what's going on inside. And so, as I mentioned, we're going to talk about 3 principles. So principle number 1 is to simply acknowledge, what are you experiencing, right? Like, what are you experiencing? Like, even right now, what are you experiencing? So, how to do that? Like, you could ask yourself, what's happening in your body? What's happening in your body right now? So I was sharing with the team right before we began, I'm into day 4 of caffeine withdrawal. So what I'm experiencing in my body, I wouldn't wish on any of you. And you're also on the right side of the screen. So the murderous phase isn't yet done. But like, what's happening in your body, right? For me, it's this pounding headache up and down my neck and shoulders, and from the back of my head to my front of my head, right? I hope you're not experiencing that, but just notice, like, what's happening in your body right now, and like, what are the emotions that are coming along with that, and like, what are the stories in your head? Some of the questions we received earlier, the questions like, okay, when is this going to be over, right? When is this going to be over, right? And so if that's the story in your head, like, when is this going to be over? How's that influencing what your sense of choices are, or what your sense of choices, what's possible for you, right? So by understanding like what's going on right now, right? Then the next step is like understanding, how is that affecting what you see as possible or not possible? Like, what action can you take or not take? And then what result does that get? Right? So we start to bring a greater level of awareness to immediate experience and seeing how we're shaping our own experience. And so, if we had to take off the veneer and, really honestly ask yourself, what are you actually feeling, right? What are you actually feeling? What's actually happening inside you? I did this with a leadership group recently, and the boss sent me this note afterwards saying, I didn't realize, I signed my team up for this, but I didn't realize how much I needed something like this for me, right? And so I think in this day and age, in this kind of historical moment with all of these things happening, being able to check in and understanding what's going on inside yourself is really the first and most important step to being able to manage the whole outer situation. So that leads us to principle 2. Is learning how, first, principle 1 is acknowledging what are you experiencing. And principle 2 is accepting what's going on inside, right? Accepting the inner experience, not necessarily the outer experience, because that might need changing, right? But when you accept inner experience, it allows that experience to flow. And if we suppress it or push it away or spill it into the environment, give the emotion to other people, right? That creates more struggle and suffering, right? Internally. And so we're talking about an internal move here, right? So acknowledging and accepting, oh, right now, here is what I'm experiencing. And, if you want to know, here's some research done at Carnegie Mellon that basically says the same thing, right? Accepting what you're feeling is really what helps you keep it together and to make more sensible choices in the heat of what might otherwise be difficult. Another way to look at it is that there are like 3 ways of managing reactive emotion. One is pushing it away, right? Suppressing it, pretending it's not there, denying it, or distracting yourself from what you're experiencing. On the other side is the opposite. You're spilling it out in the environment. You're grasping onto a thought and amplifying it or catastrophizing it, making it worse than it is. And so we oftentimes bounce between these 2 poles. In Japan, what I've noticed, after 20 years of working there, right, the favorite strategy is to push it away in the moment, and then it comes out later somewhere else. We have the phenomena of the yelling shacho, the yelling president, or the yelling boss, right? And so that's certainly one way to deal with one's emotions, but it's certainly not the most effective. And so there's a third option, which is accepting, right? And allowing the emotion, right? Accepting the emotion, what you're experiencing in the moment, allowing it to kind of rise up and pass away. So I call it surfing. So this takes practice, but this we know is what's really the most effective in terms of being able to manage inner experience. And there's you didn't know there's going to be math today, but here's another way to think about it, right? That this is a formulation done by Shinzen Young, whose research is being used at Carnegie Mellon, actually. That the sense of internal struggle, right? The internal struggle is a result of the amount of pain we experience and the resistance we give it, right? So, and again, it's the inner resistance. So, you can do the math. If pain is not the presence of pain in life is not an option, right? That the value of that is going to be greater than 0. So then what can you do? You learn how to stop resisting what you're experiencing, right? So I've been working with my caffeine headache all for the last several days, right? Not allowing it to irritate me or bother me. But so this is kind of a simple but I think clear way of demonstrating, what happens when you drop resistance to the unpleasant things that happen to you. There's a pleasant version of this, which we'll talk about in a minute, but consider, like, what are you giving resistance to, and internally, and if you ratcheted that down a bit, what would that do to your sense of internal struggle? Here's what one person said. This is the husband of a colleague of mine. He's a physician, and this quote came right at the beginning of the COVID crisis. And so we didn't know when the wave was going to hit. And his kind of preferred way of dealing with his anxiety was pretending it wasn't there or pushing it away. But then when he started to work with acceptance, he said, he sent me a note saying, or she sent me a note saying, he learned how to bounce back quicker. And that it's not always perfect, right? And even with my caffeine headache, it's not always perfect, my relationship to it. But when he acknowledged what he's experiencing, right, ironically, right, these difficult feelings are here, and he's acknowledging it, that at the end, he felt more in control of himself, right? And so that's the ironic process that's going on here. So one thing I would ask you to consider is to let go of the assumption that suppressing emotions makes you strong, that it's actually the opposite, that suppressing emotions takes a lot of energy. And by using a lot of energy, it in fact makes you more brittle, right? And so, because at some point there's going to be containment failure, and that emotion is going to come out. So the other thing is to accept the fact that your mood is going to go up and down. Even within the day, your mood is going to go up and down, right? And so that's just the human reality. And that lets us, that paves the way to principle number 3, right? So if principle 1 is acknowledging what you're experiencing, principle 2 is accepting that internal experience, principle 3 is the idea that attention needs somewhere good to go, right? That we will automatically look for what's wrong, what's broken, what's what are threats in your environment, that we automatically look for that. That's the way that we're programmed as human beings. And so we need to be more conscious of how we're investing our attention, right? If we think about attention as a currency, it's kind of the energy you have to invest in your life, and that what you attend to is really what your life becomes. And so one of my favorite questions to ask people is like, what are you giving your attention to? And are they things that you can control, right? You're giving your attention to something, right? And so are you giving it to things that are having a negative impact on your own internal experience, right? Like I found that a 24/7 relationship to the news these days is not a healthy one. And so I kind of made a policy for myself. I go in, get what I need, and I come back out. But we don't dwell on it. And so, what can you control right now, right? What can you control right now? And can you give your attention to that? Another thing you could give your attention to is like, what's beautiful, right? What's beautiful? Like even right now, if you're to look around in the place you're at, like what's beautiful? And how do you attune your mind to beauty in your environment? It's interesting. If you do a Google search on beauty, you get usually 2 things. One is how to make yourself more attractive, or cultural arguments of whose definition of beauty counts or doesn't count. And those are important. But there's an other aspect of beauty, which I think as a culture we've kind of stopped talking about, which is the revivifying quality of beauty, the nourishing quality of beauty. And how beauty can be a source of energy for you. And so in a way, one of the reasons I'm so delighted to do this for the Japan Society is because the appreciation and creation of beauty is one of Japan's special geniuses. This is and even right now, the exhibit that happens to be up is a fantastic example of this. That for I think any number of reasons, Japanese culture is so attuned to the presence of beauty throughout the entire culture. It's almost like an obsession. And from this exhibit on Boro textiles, which are kind of used up pieces of material that have been fashioned into something else, primarily because people didn't have resources, right? But there was still an attunement to beauty nonetheless, to the lunch boxes, right? And the aestheticization of lunch boxes, to the Japanese genius to aestheticize everything, really is something that's very special. And I think that maybe it's because in Japanese history there's this relentless march of disaster, right? Whether it's earthquake or a volcano or typhoon, right? And that for much of Japanese history, life was tough, right? There weren't many resources. And I think that one way the culture sustained itself is by attuning to beauty. And that's something I think that Japan can teach us, right? And that's, I think, one of the reasons why the Japan Society is such a special place. It's because it's this gateway to that way of seeing the world. And so how do you attune yourself to what's beautiful around you? And how do you do it as a regular practice? I think is something, that you might wish to consider. It's interesting, Peter Drucker had this recognition that Japan's culture is primarily perceptual, right? And that it's a perceiving culture, not necessarily an intellecting culture, right? And that by being a perceiving culture, right, it attunes itself to the material manifestation of things. How do you sense things? And what's interesting is that he had this relationship with Japanese art, and you might know that he had a phenomenal collection of Japanese art. But when he was living in Washington during World War II, he would routinely visit the Asian Art Museum to recover his sanity. Right, in the darkness of war, he would frequently visit I think it's probably the Sackler, right? And he said, "Oh, it helped me recover my sanity and perspective of the world." And I thought that's such a powerful statement, you know. And part of my work really is to create the platform on which to help people do this, right? And so for Ito-en, I helped to create the Ito-en Ocha experience, right? Which was we kind of reimagined tea ceremony as the daily preparation of tea, not the formal tea ceremony, but the daily preparation of tea as a moment to reconnect to yourself. And that's been a very successful and interesting experiment. Another project I did, I did another project called Mericha with Mitsubishi Real Estate to kind of create what would be a 21st century meditation studio. That's a play of light and nature and sound. And if you get to go to Tokyo at some point, please check it out. It's a really fantastic place. But in any case, the question is like, what are you giving your attention to? This quote here, this came from a student of mine. He said, "Oh, I felt like I pulled myself out of a cul-de-sac that I'd driven myself into, and I came out more hopeful, and my energy came back." Right. And so the question is, what are you giving your attention to? What are you giving your attention to on a moment-to-moment basis? And oftentimes, if we're not conscious of it, it's really we give our attention to fear. I ask people, how are you managing fear, or is fear managing you? And so I think that's another one of the challenges we have, as evidenced by the word cloud before. So what is fear, right? Fear is a reaction that creates energy to defend yourself, to escape, to freeze, so that an attacker can walk by, so that it doesn't notice you. In the last few years, I've stopped thinking about emotions as positive emotions or negative emotions, right? Like there's the emotions you want to have versus the emotions you don't want to have. And I don't think that's a really helpful way of thinking about emotion. I think that they're emotions of survival and protection, which is fear, right? Fear is one of them. Anger, disgust, boredom, frustration, right? Those are really emotions at their heart of protection. And that they're the other emotions like love or happiness, curiosity, are enjoyment, right? Those are the emotions of connection and growth. And so we move between states of defense and protection and connection and growth. And so fear is very useful, right? Fear is very useful to have. But we want to have a balanced relationship with it. And that our fear system, our protection system, is adapted to short-term, concrete threats to our survival, like, tigers chasing you down Broadway. And instead, right, what we've evolved into is a social system that's far more complicated, right? Far more sophisticated than simply, being chased by a tiger and I need to escape the tiger and I need to run, run away from this, right? That we have threats that are far more subtle, right? Including this one, right? And, this is like the big self-management test for humanity, I think. Because it requires us to do things that are really against our nature in some way. Stay away from one another. Discipline yourself so that even in the frustration of all of this, don't do something that's going to go expose you, right? And it's a really interesting test for us, I think. And so when we talk about managing oneself at some level, right, it's about managing a nervous system. And the idea of managing oneself has a lot of different layers to it, but the most important one is learning how to manage this survival system, which is which is what your nervous system, is attached to. So like, what is that? Right? Your nervous system is divided into two branches, right? There's the parasympathetic nervous system, which is kind of relaxing, calming down, connecting with other people. Your heart rate goes down, your breathing gets easier, your digestion works fine. And then so you can think of that like the brake. And then on the other side is like the gas pedal, the sympathetic nervous system. Your heart rate goes up, your muscles brace for action, conversion of glycogen to glucose. That's why we know there's a fairly strong relationship between chronic stress and diabetes. And it's all in order to power this power this energy, right? You need to have, to power this reaction, right? You need to have energy. You need to have like cheap, easy energy. So what do we do? We crave sugar, fat, carbohydrate. And so, chronic sympathetic activation can get us into a problem. And then the one down there, the secretion of adrenaline, right? That's what all of us type A maniacs love. So, we're moving between states of activation, states of deactivation. And another way to think about it is, you've got these three zones, right? And so I mentioned this earlier in the agenda, like what zone are you in? The green zone, you can think about it as the zone of coherence. The image that I've been working with the last few months is like, how in a sea of chaos can you be an island of coherence and calm, right? And there's a kind of nervous system state associated with that. And that when there's too much stimulation, we pop into the red zone, right? That's the attack and defense, avoid and escape. And then at some point, the adrenaline starts to run out, right? People said earlier in the word cloud, oh, I feel drained, right? The adrenaline runs out, and that we sink into the black zone, right? Where there's not so much energy. So if you can think about the red zone as a pot boiling over, right? That there's a greater level of internal chaos. It's 2:00 in the morning and you can't sleep. The hamster wheel is going around, right? My son, who's 4.5, said, "Oh, Papa, I can't go to sleep because my brain isn't calm yet," right? And so muscle tension, impulsiveness, irritability, anger, rage, that whole continuum. FDS is a disease I made up called Frivolity Deficiency Syndrome, right? It's a serious disease, right? The 10 different ways the world is going to end, and nobody invites you to their birthday party. I found that the best way to cure it is to marry somebody who doesn't have it, which is, in my case, my wife is a far more optimistic, future-oriented person than her husband is. The cheeseburger chocolate axis, right? So that's what we talked about earlier, right? That's all the junk food we've been eating since March. So this is the place of a kind of hyperactive nervous system, right? And what's important to know is this isn't bad, because this is useful, right? At some point, it's useful. It's useful to be in the red zone for a short period of time, because maybe you do need to escape the burning building. Maybe you need to step out of the way of the oncoming bus that you've inadvertently stepped in front of, right? But as a lifestyle, it's not so healthy. And again, at some point, the adrenaline will run out in your body, and that you'll sink into the black zone. And so this is, if this is too much energy and the pot is boiling over, this is not enough energy and the pot is frozen. So depression, exhaustion, some of the things we saw earlier, right? Feeling drained, right? Immune system malfunction is where this happens. It's a kind of sense of giving up, right? And that the cure for this really is rest, because the body's overtaxed, and that it needs to re-energize itself. And ideally, where we like to be is here. This is where all of our human sophistication, our capacity to engage with others, to connect with others, to adapt to complex situations, to come up with creative solutions, that's where this happens. And this is, I think about this as like, this is the you want the world to know, right? This is the you put in your Match.com profile, right? And so here's where, you aren't necessarily calm because you could be energized and engaged, but you're in control of yourself, right? That's the key. That's the key. You're in control of yourself. And again, what I want to emphasize is that all three of these zones are legitimate human experiences. Sometimes the black zone is necessary because somebody close to you has passed away, and the nervous system moves into a state of mourning, right? So you can slow down and reconsider things, right? And so all three are important. It's just understanding, we don't want to get stuck in the extremes, right? So think about, again, going back to this, like, if this is what you're experiencing, how is that influencing your choices? How is that influencing the action you take? How is that influencing the result you get, right? Is something opening up or is something shutting down? And if you're here, right, is it a different experience, right? If you're appreciative, calm, or joyful, is that a different experience? And so for most people, it is. And so what's important, going back to our principle, is like understanding what are your tells, right? What are the signals that you can register that tells you what zone are you in, right? What does each zone look like, sound like, and feel like for you, right? What is it? How do you know you're in the red zone? How do you know you're in the black zone, right? How do you know you're feeling good? What does feeling good feel like? It's really important to understand what feeling good feels like, because when you don't feel good, we learn by contrast. And so when you don't feel good, you notice, something's a little off, right? So what are your tells? It's important to be really conscious about that. And then the next question is, like, what are the tells of the people around you, right? What are the tells of the people you work with? If you're leading a team, do you check in with each other? Do you check in with the people you live with on a daily basis? My wife and I check in at least 2 or 3 times a day because, as we talked about, that experience changes. And so you may wake up feeling in a good mood, but by lunch, things are, maybe you feel a little different, right? This situation is so dynamic. So of course our responses and reactions to it are going to be dynamic. So, and the other thing that I've noticed is that by far the most effective organizations that I've had the pleasure of witnessing over the last few months, right, that they all make space to check in with one another. And in fact, that becomes the priority, not the work, not the official work. And so that could sound like this, that they, in their regular meetings, there's a time for checking in so that people can speak to the concerns that they have, and that the organizations I've found that don't do that, right, aren't doing so well, because people have all this stuff on their mind, nobody's talking about it, and so how can you be productive in that case, right? So by making space for what people are actually experiencing, right, then it kind of creates an openness to the reality of their lives. And then by having these conversations with kind of unburden you from that, then there's more energy left over to actually get the work done. So you're probably already doing something like this. And if not, then I'd encourage you to consider it. So then the question becomes, how do we kind of get back into the green zone if you notice you're in the red zone? And maybe a lot of us have been in the red zone for weeks, if not months now, right? And so what I'd like to do is work through a little exercise together on how to get back into your green zone, okay? So this is an exercise called resourcing. And a resource, and I'm just going to walk you through this. So if these letters are a little too small, I'm just going to read everything for you. But a resource is anything that helps you feel good, strong, loved, or safe. Right? There are resources that are outside you, which could be places you like going, people who are important to you, pets. Find that pets more than spouses kind of show up on this list. Music you find soothing, right? special experiences that you've had, whatever that might be for you. And then there are internal resources inside you, right? Values that are important to you, things you like about yourself, right? So let's take a minute to think about, like, what are some resources you have, right? What are some resources you have? And I will go here. And if you want to go back to that link and just type in for a minute, go back to the link in the chat box. Let me pull that up here for a second. So put the thing in there. And then, just think about what are some resources you have. You can click on the link again. Right, anything that helps you. Intelligence, beautiful. Your spouse, wonderful. Yoga, great. Right. Cat, good. Yeah, lying in the park, it's great. Family and spouse, that's beautiful, right? We are Iado, that's great. Meditation, humor. Rachmaninoff. Right, spending time together. It's great. Look at that build. Spirituality. Prayer. Golf, great. Sake. So let's take the next step. So pick one of your resources. Pick one of your resources. We'll do a kind of guided practice. So pick one of your resources. And it's probably easier if you do this with eyes closed. So, bring to mind, first just notice what's happening in your body right now. And then bring to mind the resource. And if you were with the resource, what would you be seeing? What would you be hearing? What would you be feeling? As you put your mind on that, notice what happens inside. Right? You can visualize the resource. If it's a place, you're there. If it's a person, what does it feel like to be with that person? Right? Notice what's happening inside, and notice if there's even a small place of calm that opens up. And then put your attention there. right? And let your attention rest in that place. And you can refresh or revisit the resource as much as you'd like. And as you do that, right, notice what changes in the body. And again, what would you be seeing? What would you be hearing? What would you be feeling? And then just rest in that experience. Sometimes resources can come with, complex sides, right? Maybe a person, but you can't see them right now. Maybe a place, but you can't go there right now. And that might bring up, uncomfortable or unpleasant emotions. And that's okay. That's totally normal. And so you just acknowledge that. Acknowledge that's also part of the experience, and then shift your attention to the positive side. Like, what's good about it? What's good about it? What's good about the resource? Right? And just rest in that experience. So notice what's different compared to when we began. And what are words or phrases you would use to describe that difference? Right? And then if you want to go back to the link, you can type in some of those words or phrases. Peaceful, calmer, lighter, sleepy. Comforted, calm, centered, enlightened. Right? So just notice what I love about this exercise is that they are things that are already with you, right? That the resources are not something that it's exotic or far away, right? That they're all with you right now. And that all you have to do is shift your attention to, what's good in your life. Right? Look at that. It's already with you, right? And then all we need to do is just take a moment and shift attention, right? Have reminders for yourself. Where are things for you, right? Where are they? So let's take a look, right? Compare this word cloud with 2 word clouds ago, right? Interesting, isn't it? So compare that to this. Where and how you use your attention is important. And so how do we be more intentional about that? So thank you, everybody. That was really beautiful. This is some resources of folks I did this with the other day. What changed? So, how do we make space for this, right? And how do you make space for yourselves in this? And how do you make space for the people in your lives, the people you work with? That's what's essential, So questions to consider. Okay. What's COVID-19 and not just that, but also the protests, the shared experience we've had with the killing of George Floyd. What is this teaching you about you, right? And your relationship to challenge, right? But what is it teaching you about you? And who has it made visible that you didn't see before, right? How have recent events made things visible that you didn't see before? Like, what interconnections do you see now that you didn't see before? What has it shown you about our relationship to nature, right? The air in Los Angeles has been clear for 3 months. It's quite fascinating. And then I think most importantly, like, what has it clarified for you about what's important to you, right? What's important to you? Crisis, the opportunity of crisis is that it is incredibly clarifying. And how can you use this as a positive event in your life, even though there may be great pain, right? How do we do that? So let's do a quick review, and then we can take some questions, right? Acknowledge what you're experiencing, right? And accept that. Right now, this is what I'm experiencing. I have a client, actually the same client who I mentioned earlier. Her father is dealing with Alzheimer's disease. And she said, what this process did for me was it helped me get to acceptance a lot faster, because there was part of me that was really resisting this, that the father I knew was no longer there. And you can bet I resisted the heck out of that. But I realized that in order for me to be effective in this situation, I needed to accept what reality was so I could deal with it. And these skills got me to acceptance faster so I could deal with it and be a positive influence for my own family, right? And how do we check in regularly? Check in regularly with yourself, most of all. And then shift attention towards what's good and what's beautiful. Be clear about what are you giving your attention to on a daily basis, and what you give your attention to is what your life is, right? It's as simple as that. It's like a fundamental truth in this world. Like, you are what you attend to. And then discuss and help others understand what their tells are in terms of what zones, and then how do you become aware of and help others become aware of what their resources are. And then most importantly, what are you learning, right? What are you learning in all this? So, I think it's clear that the reason I do this work is that, the 21st century is going to be not a boring time. It has 2020 for sure hasn't been boring at all. And the world needs the best of us. And the reason I do this work is to help people find that and grow it and strengthen it and share it. This is a photo of Australia a few months ago from the fires. And when I found this, it completely blew my mind, right? But, I don't want to end on a downer note, but this is our reality at some level, and that we're going to have to face it. And that the best way we can face it is by, creating this internal platform to be effective and to be able to manage crisis. In my own case, how the Great Kidney Adventure ended was that in 2008, I a physician friend of mine read off a list of the signs of uremic poisoning, and which are the signs that your kidneys are failing. And as he's going off the list, I'm checking off every one of those items. And my physician and I later that week had a chat about, okay, what are my options? And he said, well, you've got three options, right? You can live on dialysis, which you might know that in the United States, the dialysis mortality rate is something like 20% a year. You could go on a list and wait for a kidney to show up. In Los Angeles, where I live, that's a 7 to 8 year wait. So if the mortality rate is on dialysis is 20% a year and it's an 8 year wait, it doesn't really look so good. And at that point, 60,000 Americans needed a kidney and about 16,000 got them. And now I think it's something like 90,000 Americans need a kidney, and it's much lower. The rate of people who get one is much lower. And then the third option is that you could ask for living donation and ask somebody to donate a kidney to you. And I don't know about you, but most men I know won't even ask for directions, let alone an organ. So I had to do all of this stuff that we've talked about on myself, and dealing with my own pride and need to do things myself. But in any case, at the beginning of 2008, I sent out a letter to basically everybody I knew, who said, this is what my situation is, and would you be willing to help me? And a few months later, the donor coordinator at Cedars-Sinai Hospital called me to say, I'm calling to let you know that we're turning all your donors away, and your donor volunteers away. And I said, well, what do you mean? And she said, well, there's so many that we can't process the volunteers for the other patients. So we're going to stop yours from now. And I thought, well, how many of them are there? And at that point, there were 24. And I said, well, that's interesting. And the competitive part of me got on the phone, and I said, so, what's the record? And it turns out that the old record was 7. I thought, okay, I'll take 24. In the end, there were more, but it turns out of those 24, 13 were my former students, and including my donor, who was an Amazon warrior of a woman who rebuilds motorcycles and V8 engines and things like that. And at the end of 2008, we did the surgery, and a month later, she hiked the Pacific Crest Trail, which goes from the southern border of California to Canada. And I had relentless fantasies of Aston Martin V8 Vantages for about 2 weeks after the surgery. So this is all to say that transformation is possible, right? And transformation is necessary for us now. And I hope that this has been a useful experience for you. And maybe in the chat, if you want, like, what are, just out of curiosity, like, what are things that you might do differently because of this conversation? And if you're Japanese, I actually published a book this year written specifically for the Japanese audience. It's published by President, but it's the Drucker School self-management class, Transform Your Results. But I think it's available at Kinokuniya if you want it. But if you're interested, that's okay. You please check it out. So let's see. Are there any questions? Let me see here. So some of you sent questions in earlier. Let me bring them up. Let's see. A second. All right. So let's see. What advice could you offer martial artists for whom the equilibrium of the mind centers on practice for coping during shutdown? Well, it's a great question. And in fact, I think of this work as a kind of martial art in some way. That I would say start with your center of gravity, right? Start with your center of gravity and go there. And then see what happens. The second question, during this COVID crisis, work from home has become the norm for many organizations. And how can a group come out of this situation stronger and better than before? And what can the group do to accomplish this? And I kind of touched upon this earlier, but really, I think, making space for each other's experience and making space to talk about it and what people's concerns are, where are they at, what do they need beyond the work situation. And the most effective teams I have encountered do that. How do you handle your personal storm while everyone else is having fine weather, right? In other words, should you maintain a facade or a front, and how to keep that up? I would, in that situation, find out who can be your source of support, right? That you can talk to, even if it's just one person. What I've found is that, creating a support system is essential, and maybe that's outside of the family. Let's see, how do you recommend offering someone these tips who seems to be struggling but hasn't expressed that or asked for help? I have a policy of not forcing things on people, but rather just inquiring, again, like, how are things going? And it's really up to them to be open to alternatives. So there's only so much you can be responsible for. How early education of the right kind is most important to change this world? Yes. To help children to be aware of and manage their own emotions, I think, is really an essential kind of education. In this culture, we've defined education as thinking, teaching people to think, and not necessarily teaching them to feel and deal with their emotions in that way. Let's see. I'm in the middle of a storm without any foothold or something to hold on to, and then there's nothing for me to rely on, and what should I do? So, I interviewed a woman once who was an incredible human being. She was one of the first female fund managers, and she managed over $120 million in different families' assets. And this was in the late 1990s. It was in the early 2000s I met her. And all at once, right, the economy at that point crashed. And so all of her clients were calling, worried about their family's futures. She and her husband of 30 years divorced. She moved from the home that they had been living in for decades. Her business partner left her, and she was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer and told that she had 6 months to live. How she dealt with any one of those things would be incredibly stressing, right? And her answer to that, her name was Mary Hamilton, and she was on the board of directors for a local community college, and just was an incredible, radiant human being. And I said, I said, so how did you do this? And she said, this is where really intensely being present saved me. She said, her exact words were, I walked the razor's edge of being in the present. And that if I went one degree into the past with regret about what are things I could have done differently, or 1 degree into the future about what the heck is going to happen to me, I would have totally lost my mind. And she said, I just relentlessly kept walking this fine line of being in the present. And, of course, letting these intense emotions kind of come and go, right? Let them come and go. And she ended up living another, I want to say, almost 2 years after that process, after her diagnosis, right? The thing about what she was experiencing was that she could die at any moment, really, in terms of what the disease was doing to her body. And that meeting her very early in my career was really of quite a powerful signpost, this is how you deal with that kind of thing. And of course, I had my own thing to deal with, but really focusing on, what's happening right now is essential. So good luck to you. Oh, my husband just died and we had no children, and I'm facing this crisis alone. Any advice? This question really struck a chord with me. One is partly, obviously you're going to be in the mourning process for a while. And I had somebody pass away earlier this year as well, actually two people. And understanding, again, like, where are you putting your attention, and making space for your own emotions, I think is really essential. The reason why this is one of the reasons why I wanted to make the point that these three zones were all normal and healthy parts of human experiencing, because in mourning, we naturally go into the black zone, and don't resist that, right? Don't resist that. The other thing in kind of learning, my cousin's husband, who was not even 40, suddenly passed away about a year ago. And so kind of walking with her through that process, I've learned that the mourning process comes in waves. And so it's not a staged phenomena, it's a wave phenomena. And that you can feel good one day, and then suddenly another wave will come. So understand that when those waves come, that's nothing wrong. There's nothing wrong with you. And that's just the way it is. And that over time, the waves may still come, but their intensity decreases. And when those waves come, right, that's where principle 2 is really helpful. Is don't resist it, right? It's there for a reason. And then it's just something to work through. And then again, what are resources you can have, even non-human resources, right? And they are there if you open to them. So I hope that helps. I know it's an insufficient answer to a very big issue. Yeah, how do we learn to pivot when there's no process, or processes keep changing due to this changing environment? We must learn to pivot. And like, how do we learn to pivot, right? That's a wonderful question. Another topic I work a lot with is how to deal with change. Well, one is understanding what's the resistance that comes up when change happens, right? And another thing about pivoting is kind of letting go of what you thought was going to be real in this last moment, and what do we need to do now, right? So part of it is a kind of letting go of what your assumptions and expectations about what reality are going to be, and that, I think, is one way to deal with that. It's a great question. Can I comment on any similarities between stoic approaches and mindfulness, basically, in managing adversity? And I think the key is this process of acceptance, right? That they're both acceptance-oriented strategies to dealing with experience. How prevalent will working remotely be moving forward? I of course, I don't know the answer to that, but my guess is it's going to be much more prevalent. And I know some people actually prefer it. But I think it'll be much more prevalent. And what message do you tell yourself when you wonder if you're going to be all right? It's a wonderful question. I don't tell myself a message. I shift my attention to what's good, and I focus intently on that. And I don't push away, and I also don't push away the fact that I might feel freaked out of my skin too. So, and, again, what are the sources of support you can create for yourself? The bigger question for me, and this is that I lost the fear of dying. And I think if you can lose the fear of dying, then that takes a lot of stuff off the table. But that's not something you do overnight. But the gift of facing mortality kind of early in life was that it clarified what was important, and that I understood death was the end of it, and that's just the way it is, right? So what is acceptance? Here's a question. What does acceptance mean or look like? How do you accept or experience your emotions, right? And without letting them control you. Okay. And if you can't move on, does that mean you're not accepting? Sometimes. So let's just walk through that. Like, very frequently, an emotional reaction will have a corresponding state in the body. And that it you might register as a tightness or a pressure or a pull, something like that. And so you could put your attention on that sensation in the body, right? Or maybe just a little corner of it. Let's say if there's, let's pretend, I noticed that there's a feeling of something that's like a brick in my stomach. And so you might put your attention just on the corner of that brick and let it rest there. And then just see what happens next. What I would suggest is start by doing the resourcing exercise and then bring to mind whatever challenge you're feeling. And then just notice it, right? Just notice it. And, put your attention just on a little tiny corner of it and then rest with it and see what happens. It will usually start to transform or shift. It's not something that's learned in 5 minutes, but that's the basic principle, right? Starting to notice where you're disliking it, where you're trying to push it away. And then what happens, experimenting a little bit with just what happens with not trying to push it away and just letting it be there, and see what that does. Here's a very powerful question, right? How can you present these teachings to an addict? The question is, does the addict want them or not? And if they do, then you can kind of go take the next step. But if they don't, then it's really up to the addict. How do you think about reinventing yourself without getting depressed or overwhelmed? It's okay to get depressed or overwhelmed, right? And that's oftentimes part of the reinvention process. And again, not pushing that away, but at the same time, also, when we're going through a transition, we very, a world ends, right? A world ends, and we kind of feel unmoored from that. And so we feel like I call it the zombie zone. You're kind of wandering around. And so along with that experience, oftentimes comes anxiety or depression or a sense of hopelessness or what's my role in this world. And so we've got two things to do in that process. One is exploring, right, is making space for that experience. And at the same time, exploring new things and building new bridges. So like, I have a rule. So I'll tell you, after my surgery, the first 3 months after surgery, after the transplant, are when most organ rejection happens. And so it was kind of a little tense to see, okay, was everything going to be okay? And then 3 months passed and everything was okay. And then the next 3 months were, wow, it was a question of, okay, am I going to live? And then the 3 months passed, like, oh, I'm going to live. And then I had about 6 months of, oh, I'm going to live. And then at 9 months, it was, oh my God, I'm going to live. And I had to think about making a future in a way that I never really had to before, because I didn't assume I was going to live. And I fell into a huge depression that lasted about a year to 18 months or so. And which was very strange, right? My body had never been healthier. I had a happy ending, right? I had this amazing donor, had a very healthy kidney. The surgery went really great. And yet I was less and less interested in being alive. And I realized that, oh, there was a whole body of research or literature about this topic on transition, and that this was a natural outcome of dealing with change, is that oftentimes people kind of move into this zombie zone, their old familiar world, no matter how good or bad is gone, and that oftentimes people, this is what happens, and nobody even tells you that, right? It's like, I have a friend who finished his dissertation and, and then fell into depression, because something changed. And so how you navigate that zombie zone is doing a lot of care for yourself, making space for yourself and all those difficult emotions. And at the same time, I created rules for myself. I turned down no invitation, go to some place you've never been, learn a skill learn to do something you don't know how to do, but you've always wanted to, and to meet new people, right? Build new networks and try new things. And then at some point, something sticks. Right? I think about it like you're going to shop for a new wardrobe and you're picked out all these clothes and you don't know which one of those clothes are going to be you. And so you're standing in front of the mirror trying to say, okay, is this me? No, this isn't me. And then you put on something else. Is this me? No, this isn't me. And it's like that. And at some point, something's going to stick. And then you'll start to see what that is. Where does your energy start to be attracted, or where does the energy start to move up? What are you called to do? Right? Think about it in that way and see what happens. Okay. There's a whole 7-week class I have on it. So this is my best 3-minute answer. Generation Z is virtually based and has issues with realities. I think we all have issue with reality, but how can they shift the paradigm of true emotional intelligence? I don't like answering questions with such generality, but it's a human challenge, right? It's a human challenge of dealing with these emotions. And so it's already things we've talked about in a way, like acknowledging what you're experiencing and accepting that. Another issue is the issue of unhealed trauma, and which is something that comes up a lot, even with high functioning people, right? That there may be some unrepaired trauma in some background that's really affecting their capacity to either adapt or deal with intense stuff. And in that way, I strongly urge you to seek out what a somatically based trauma therapist, right? So somatically based is about the body. How do they help the body? And if you live in New York and you want a referral, send me a note. I will give you a referral to somebody who's quite excellent. So, but that's oftentimes when people have a hard time dealing with reality, it's because reality has in some ways been unkind, and that there are things that need repair. How do you face old age with your own mortality as you approach 70? What do you need to bring to closure is one question I'd have, right? What are the letters you need to write? What are the conversations you need to have is one thing. And I think the other is what is left undone that you still want to do. And how can you put attention in starting to make some of those things happen? The process of dying is a lot like the process of living. And so we can embrace it and use that process as a time for growth. I have to say my own father's passing was a very powerful one. He used his own mortality as a source of growth, and used it as a way to face his own fears and to repair and heal things that he needed to repair and heal in terms of relationships and all of that. So I can take my classes if you're not a student at the university? It's a good question. Actually, I'm developing a virtual one, so so stay tuned. You might regret that, actually. But any other questions or comments? But these have been wonderful. In fact, they're quite profound. I mean, I really appreciate your engagement. I mean, you're bringing up the most essential issues of life and death, and again, I think that's where these kind of crises are valuable, because it takes a lot of the stuff off the table. You know, what's really important to you. I mean, it'd be very curious to know, you know, for many of you, like what have you learned through this process, these multiple ongoing crises that we've encountered, and you know, what does that look like for you? Let's see. Yes, where do we stay tuned? It's a good question. I'll have something on my website, which is jeremyhunter.net, or my LinkedIn page. You feel free to link in, because everything will be there. But the picture looks like me, I think, so you should be able to recognize it. Where's the museum in Tokyo again? Which museum is that? Oh, the museum in Tokyo. Oh, I see. No, it's the Japan Society Gallery that the exhibit is in, and that if you go to the Japan Society website, there's an online exhibition of the gallery, which is really beautiful. I highly recommend you looking at it. Yeah. So, anything else? But in any case, I think that's a wrap. We have about 5 minutes to go. But thank you very much. If it matters, my headache is gone. So there's some kind of virtual caffeine that comes about from doing these webinars. So yes, okay, yeah, Frederick. Yes, it's the Japan Society Gallery. And you can see it on the website. So thank you very much. And thanks to the team for making all this happen. And it's now kind of 10:30 in Los Angeles. I'm more awake, and I hope you have a good day, and happy to do this again if you'd like. I got 34 more weeks of material to torture you with if you'd like. So in any case, thank you very much and have a good day. Take care.